A storm rages through the night, and a family's worst fear becomes reality. A young boy vanishes into the darkness. As panic sets in, their loyal dog, Buddy, takes off into the woods, guided by something no one can explain. What starts as a desperate rescue mission turns into a journey into the past, uncovering a shocking connection to a family tragedy long thought lost to time. In the heart of the storm, courage, love, and loyalty collide, proving that some bonds are unbreakable. This is not just a story of survival. It's a story of redemption, sacrifice, and the incredible ways our loved ones, human and animal, find their way back to us. What did Buddy discover in the depths of the forest? And how does it change everything for this family? Watch now to uncover the truth that will leave you breathless. Where's Sam? Shouted Emily, her voice barely cutting through the roaring thunder. John, gripping a flashlight tightly, scanned the drenched park trail, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was right behind us. He yelled back, wiping rain from his eyes. Sam, answer me. Emily's voice cracked with desperation as she turned toward the dense woods that bordered the park. The storm had come out of nowhere. Just an hour ago, the family had been enjoying a peaceful picnic, with Sam running circles around Buddy, their loyal golden retriever, who barked happily in response. The sky was clear then, the day warm and full of laughter. But now, with lightning splitting the sky and rain drenching the earth, their 6-year-old son was nowhere to be found. Why didn't I keep him closer? Emily murmured to herself, guilt gripping her chest. She clutched her raincoat tighter, as though the fabric could shield her from the storm raging within her. Buddy barked sharply, pulling at his leash. The dog's ears were pinned back, his body tense. He lunged toward the trees, the leash taut in John's hand. Buddy thinks he knows something, Emily said, her voice rising with a fragile hope. John hesitated, torn between chasing after Buddy's instincts and staying on the main path where they last saw Sam. He can't go out there alone. We'll lose him too, he protested. But Buddy barked again, pulling harder, his paws slipping slightly in the mud but his determination unwavering. Emily didn't wait for John's permission. She unclipped the leash, letting Buddy bound into the woods. Buddy, find him, she shouted, watching the dog disappear into the dark tangle of trees. John grabbed Emily's arm. We need more people. We can't do this alone in this storm. His practical tone masked his own growing fear. He pointed toward their car parked at the trailhead. We'll call for help. Now. Emily hesitated for a brief moment, her eyes locked on the spot where Buddy vanished. Then with trembling hands she nodded. Together they sprinted back toward the car, their shoes slipping in the thickening mud. Buddy meanwhile charged deeper into the forest. His sharp nose sniffed the air, filtering the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. His ears flicked at every sound, focusing only on the faint trace of Sam's scent carried by the wind. Each step was purposeful, his paws splashing through puddles without hesitation. Suddenly Buddy stopped. His nose dipped closer to the ground, sniffing frantically at a small patch of broken twigs and disturbed leaves. He barked sharply once, then twice before following the scent further into the shadows. Ahead, a faint sound emerged, soft, almost drowned out by the rain. A whimper. Buddy's ears perked and his pace quickened. The boy was there. Sam sat huddled beneath the twisted roots of an old oak tree, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His rain-soaked jacket clung to him as he shivered uncontrollably. When he saw Buddy, his face lit up with relief, and his arms stretched out instinctively. Buddy? Sam's voice was weak but filled with a flicker of hope. The dog rushed to him, pressing his wet fur against the boy and licking his face. Sam buried his fingers in Buddy's thick coat, holding on as though the dog was his lifeline. But they weren't safe yet. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the forest was growing darker. Buddy nudged Sam gently as if urging him to stand, but Sam winced. His left leg was twisted at an awkward angle, the pain evident in his tear-streaked face. I can't, Sam whispered, his voice trembling. It hurts too much. Buddy barked again, a low and steady sound that seemed to say, stay strong. He circled the boy, nudging him carefully to encourage movement. But when Sam didn't budge, Buddy made a decision. Gripping the sleeve of Sam's jacket gently between his teeth, the dog tugged, testing his strength. Sam understood. You're going to take me home? He asked, his voice faint but trusting. Buddy barked in response. He crouched low, allowing Sam to wrap an arm around his neck. Slowly and carefully, Buddy began dragging the boy toward safety, his muscles straining with every step. In the distance, the faint sound of Emily's voice echoed through the trees. Sam. Buddy? Buddy stopped for a moment, his ears perking up. He barked loudly, the sound cutting through the storm. Relief filled Sam's face as he heard his mother's voice. "We're here?" Sam yelled, his voice breaking but filled with desperate hope. Buddy barked again, louder this time, until the voices grew closer. Moments later, flashlight beams cut through the dark, and Emily and John came into view, their faces pale with fear. "Sam?" Emily cried, rushing toward her son. She fell to her knees, pulling him into her arms. John knelt beside Buddy, stroking the dog's wet fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "You're a good boy." Buddy wagged his tail weakly, exhausted but triumphant. The storm raged on around them, but for this moment the family was whole again. "Are you sure he's okay?" Emily's voice trembled as she bundled Sam in a thick blanket inside the family's SUV. Rain still pounded on the windshield, lightning flashing sporadically across the dark sky. John crouched beside her, double-checking Sam's leg. "It's not broken, but we're going to the hospital to be sure," he said, trying to keep his tone steady for her sake. Buddy sat on the floor between Sam's feet, his fur matted with mud and rainwater. He rested his head on the boy's knee, refusing to leave his side. Despite the chill in the air, Sam managed a small smile as he ran his fingers through the dog's damp coat. "I don't know what I would have done without Buddy," Sam whispered, his voice faint but sincere. Emily squeezed her son's hand. "You're safe now, sweetheart. That's all that matters." As they drove toward the hospital, the storm began to ease, though the tension inside the car remained thick. Buddy's quiet presence was a comfort, but John couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, as if making sure Sam was still there. Once they reached the emergency room, doctors confirmed John's initial assessment. Sam's leg was sprained, not broken. A nurse bandaged it and gave Sam instructions to rest, but the boy's attention never wavered from Buddy, who had followed them as far as the hospital doors. "Can he come inside?" Sam asked, his voice breaking as he looked back at Buddy, who sat obediently outside in the rain. Emily shook her head gently. "Not this time, honey. But we'll take him home as soon as we're done here." Sam nodded, though his eyes lingered on the glass door where Buddy's silhouette was still visible. Later that night, after returning home and settling Sam into bed, Emily and John sat together in the living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Buddy lay at their feet, finally dry but still visibly tired from the ordeal. "I can't believe we almost lost him," Emily said softly, her hands trembling as she held a mug of tea. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes on Buddy. "We didn't," he said firmly. "Because of him." Buddy's ears perked up slightly at the sound of John's voice, but the dog didn't move, too exhausted to do more than lift his head. Emily nodded, but her expression remained clouded. "Do you think he knew where Sam was? I mean, really knew?" John shrugged. "I don't know how to explain it. But the way he acted, it was like he wasn't just following a scent. It was like he knew Sam needed him." Emily glanced toward the stairs where Sam was sleeping. "We owe him everything," she murmured, her voice heavy with gratitude. In the days that followed, Sam began to recover and life seemed to return to normal. But the events of that night lingered in the back of everyone's minds, especially Sam's. "Why did you come for me, Buddy?" Sam asked one afternoon as he sat on the couch with his leg propped up. Buddy was curled beside him, his head resting on the boy's lap. Buddy didn't answer, of course, but his warm brown eyes seemed to hold a wisdom that Sam couldn't quite explain. It was during one of these quiet moments that Sam noticed something strange. "Mom," he called out. Emily appeared in the doorway. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sam held up a small object he had been fiddling with, a tarnished silver medallion on a broken chain. "I found this in the woods," he said. "Buddy carried it back with us." Emily frowned and took the medallion from him. She examined it closely, her expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper. "This looks old," she said, running her thumb over the engraved initials on the back. Her breath caught as she whispered, "Jeff." "What is it?" Sam asked, noticing the change in her tone. Emily hesitated, then looked at Buddy, who was now sitting upright, watching her intently. "I think this belonged to your Uncle Jack." Sam blinked in surprise. "Uncle Jack? The one who—" Emily nodded, her voice heavy with emotion. "The one who disappeared during that flood years ago." Sam looked down at Buddy, his hand resting on the dog's head. "But how did Buddy find it?" Emily didn't answer right away. She turned the medallion over in her hands, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. "I don't know," she admitted. "But maybe Buddy's been part of our story for longer than we thought." Buddy's tail wagged slowly as he watched Sam sleep on the couch. The boy's soft breathing filled the quiet room, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged days earlier. Emily sat in the corner, her hands resting on the medallion. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about it, or how Buddy had found it in the middle of the forest. She glanced at the dog, who now seemed almost too calm, as though the chaos had taken a toll on him too. "You're more than just lucky, aren't you, Buddy?" she murmured. Buddy's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't move from his spot beside Sam. The next morning, John came downstairs with an old wooden box in his hands. "Emily," he called softly, careful not to wake Sam. "What is it?" she asked, setting her coffee down. John placed the box on the dining table, opening it to reveal a collection of family photographs, letters, and a few personal items. He reached inside and pulled out a picture of Jack from nearly a decade ago. "I was thinking about what you said," he began, handing her the photo. "About how Buddy might be connected to Jack somehow. I don't know if it's possible, but—" His voice trailed off as he looked at the medallion resting on the table. Emily studied the photograph. Jack stood proudly next to a large black and gold dog, his hand resting on its head. "Was this his dog?" she asked, pointing to the animal. John nodded. "Yeah. His name was Scout. They were inseparable." Emily's brow furrowed. "What happened to Scout?" "He was with Jack during the flood. Neither of them came back." Her fingers traced the edges of the photo. "Buddy isn't Scout," she said softly, almost to herself. "No, he isn't," John agreed. "But don't you think it's strange? A dog finds a medallion that belonged to someone who disappeared years ago, in the same forest where it happened. And then he leads us to Sam." Emily didn't answer. Her eyes lingered on Buddy, who had just stretched and padded over to sit by the table, his gaze fixed on the photo in her hands. Later that day, Sam insisted on sitting outside for a while, despite his injured leg. Buddy followed him to the porch, settling at his feet like a silent guardian. "Mom says you might have known Uncle Jack," Sam said, scratching Buddy behind the ears. "Do you think that's true?" Buddy tilted his head, his warm eyes locking on Sam's face as though trying to understand the question. Sam laughed softly. "You don't talk much, huh?" Emily watched them from the kitchen window, her thoughts still tangled in the strange chain of events. She didn't believe in coincidences, but this felt like something more than that, like pieces of a puzzle she didn't have all the edges for yet. "Emily?" John's voice broke through her thoughts. "Yeah? I think we need to go back to the forest." Emily turned to face him. "What? We got Sam back. Isn't that what matters?" John nodded, but his expression was serious. "It is. But something about all this feels unfinished. If there's any chance of finding out what happened to Jack, don't you think we owe it to him?" She hesitated. The idea of returning to the forest made her uneasy, but John's words resonated. "All right," she said finally. "But I'm not going without Buddy." That evening, the three of them stood at the edge of the forest. Buddy wagged his tail eagerly, his nose twitching as though he already knew why they were there. "You're leading this one," John said, patting Buddy's side. The dog didn't hesitate. He started down the trail, his steps sure and purposeful. Emily and John followed, the fading light casting long shadows on the muddy path. "Do you think he remembers?" Emily asked quietly. "Remembers what?" "Where he found the medallion. Where Sam was. Maybe even Jack." John didn't answer right away. "If he does," he said finally, "then maybe we're about to find out." Buddy stopped suddenly, his ears perking up. He sniffed the air, then turned sharply off the trail, heading into the dense undergrowth. Emily's heart raced as they pushed through the thick brush. Her mind was filled with questions, each one heavier than the last. But she kept moving, following Buddy as he led them deeper into the forest, toward answers they hadn't dared to hope for. Buddy moved quickly, weaving through the tangled undergrowth as though he had walked this path 100 times before. Emily and John struggled to keep up, their steps heavy on the damp ground. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the sounds of their movement amplified in the eerie stillness. "Buddy, wait up!" John called, but the dog didn't slow down. Emily glanced at her husband, her breath shallow. "He's not just wandering," she said. "He's going somewhere." John nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let's hope it's somewhere that makes sense." Buddy stopped abruptly, his ears standing tall as he sniffed the air. Emily caught up to him, her pulse quickening as she followed his gaze. A fallen tree lay across what appeared to be an old, overgrown path. Moss-covered stones peeked through the dirt, hinting at something man-made beneath the forest's grip. "What is this?" Emily whispered. John crouched beside the tree, brushing away dirt and leaves. "It looks like a trail marker," he said, pointing to a carved arrow on one of the stones. Buddy barked softly, pulling their attention back to him. He stood a few yards ahead, looking back at them expectantly. He wants us to follow, Emily said, her voice firm despite her growing unease. John sighed, rising to his feet. Let's keep going. The path twisted deeper into the forest, the air growing cooler and heavier with each step. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much larger than themselves. Buddy remained a few steps ahead, his movements purposeful but calm. After what felt like hours, they came to a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated wooden structure, small and weather-worn, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Is this a cabin? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, his expression darkening. I didn't know there was anything out here. Buddy walked to the cabin's entrance and sat down, his tail thumping against the ground. Emily and John exchanged a look before stepping closer. The door creaked loudly as John pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light that filtered through a broken window. Emily's eyes scanned the room, landing on a few scattered belongings: a rusted lantern, an old metal cot, and a pile of disintegrating blankets. She moved toward the corner where something glinted faintly. What's that? She asked, pointing. John followed her gaze and bent down, picking up a small metal tag. He wiped the grime away with his thumb, revealing engraved letters. Scout, he read aloud, his voice thick with disbelief. Emily's breath hitched. That was Jack's dog. This must have been where they stayed during the flood. Buddy barked again, the sound sharper this time. He pawed at the floorboards near the center of the room, his nails scratching against the wood. What is it, boy? John asked, kneeling beside him. Buddy continued scratching, his focus unwavering. Emily joined them, noticing a faint outline where the boards didn't align perfectly. Together, she and John pried the planks loose, revealing a small compartment beneath the floor. Inside was a bundle wrapped in a tattered cloth. John carefully lifted it out, unwrapping it to reveal a notebook and a worn leather collar. Emily's hands trembled as she opened the notebook. The first page was marked with Jack's handwriting. March 15th. The water's rising faster than I expected. Scout and I found this old cabin to wait it out, but I don't know how long it will hold. If anyone finds this, please know I did my best. Emily, John. I'm sorry. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she read the words aloud. John's hand tightened on her shoulder, his own face etched with grief. He was trying to get back to us, John whispered. He didn't just disappear. He fought to come home. Emily wiped her eyes, her gaze falling on the collar. She picked it up, the leather stiff but intact, and held it tightly. Why would Buddy lead you us here? She asked, her voice breaking. John looked at the dog, who sat quietly, watching them with an intensity that felt almost human. Maybe this was his way of giving us closure, he said. Of bringing Jack back to us in the only way he could. They left the cabin as the sun began to set, its warm light casting long shadows over the forest floor. Buddy walked between them, his head held high and his tail wagging softly. As they reached the edge of the forest, Emily turned back for one last look at the cabin. Thank you, Jack, she whispered. And as they stepped into the open air, it felt as though a weight had lifted, not just from the forest but from their hearts. The drive back home was quiet, each mile heavy with the weight of what they had discovered. The notebook and collar sat in Emily's lap, her fingers brushing over the worn leather as if touching it could somehow bring her closer to Jack. Buddy sat in the back seat beside Sam, his head resting against the boy's leg. Sam absently stroked his fur, his young mind trying to piece together the emotions swirling around him. Do you think Uncle Jack was scared? Sam asked suddenly, his voice soft but cutting through the silence. John glanced at Emily before answering. I think he was brave, he said. He did everything he could to protect Scout and to try to get back to us. Sam nodded, but his brow furrowed as he looked at Buddy. Do you think Buddy knows about Uncle Jack? Emily turned to face her son, searching for the right words. I think Buddy understands more than we realize. He knew where to take us, didn't he? Sam looked down at the dog, who met his gaze with calm, steady eyes. Yeah, Sam whispered. He always knows. At home, the family gathered around the dining table, the notebook now open between them. Sam sat with his chin propped on his hands, his eyes darting between the pages as Emily and John carefully read Jack's words. The entries were sparse, but each one painted a vivid picture of Jack's last days. He had found the cabin while searching for high ground, the rising floodwaters forcing him deeper into the forest. His tone was steady, even hopeful at times as he wrote about his attempts to keep Scout safe and his plans to signal for help. But the final entry stopped them all. March 17th. The water is everywhere now. Scout's been restless all day, like he knows something's coming. If you're reading this, it means you found us. I hope Scout made it out. If he did, tell him I'm sorry. I should have done more." Emily closed the notebook, her throat tight. "He thought Scout might have survived," she said. "Maybe that's what kept him going." John leaned back, his eyes focused on Buddy. "Do you think Buddy could be connected to Scout? I mean, it's been years, but—" "It doesn't matter," Emily interrupted gently, her hand resting on Buddy's head. "Whatever the connection is, he's here now. And he brought us back to Jack." Buddy wagged his tail slightly, his ears perking up at the sound of his name. He nudged Emily's hand, a small gesture that seemed to say, "I'm just doing my job." That night, after putting Sam to bed, Emily and John sat together in the living room. The notebook and collar were placed carefully on the mantel beside the photo of Jack. "It feels strange," Emily admitted. "Having answers after all this time." John nodded slowly. "Strange but, right? Like we can finally stop wondering what happened to him." Emily looked down at Buddy, who lay at her feet, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "Do you think he'll ever stop surprising us?" John smiled faintly. "Not a chance." Over the next few days, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Sam's leg healed steadily, and he returned to his usual energy, spending every spare moment with Buddy. But there was an unspoken shift in how the family viewed the dog. He was no longer just a pet. He was a bridge, a living connection to a story they hadn't known they were still writing. One afternoon, as Emily cleaned the mantel, she noticed the medallion glinting in the sunlight. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands, the engraved initials catching her eye once again. "Jess," she murmured. She glanced at Buddy, who was watching her from his spot by the couch. "You've always been part of this, haven't you?" Buddy wagged his tail once, his gaze steady. Emily smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. She placed the medallion back on the mantel, next to the notebook. "Thank you," she whispered, not entirely sure who she was thanking, Jack, Scout, or Buddy himself. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden light over the yard, Sam ran outside with Buddy close on his heels. The boy's laughter rang out as he tossed a ball, watching Buddy chase it with boundless energy. From the porch, Emily and John watched them, their hands intertwined. "He's happy again," Emily said softly. John nodded. "Because he knows he's safe. And because of Buddy?" Emily rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes never leaving the boy and his dog. "We all are," she said. "Because of him." Buddy stopped briefly, looking back at them before bounding after Sam again. His wagging tail was a silent reminder that some bonds didn't need words to be understood. The days grew quieter, but the presence of Jack's memory lingered in the air. The notebook, the collar, and the medallion had become more than just relics. They were pieces of a story Emily and John were still trying to comprehend. Sam, however, seemed content to let the past rest, his focus now entirely on Buddy, who rarely left his side. One morning, as Sam played with Buddy in the yard, John approached Emily with a hesitant look. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said. Emily glanced up from the garden she was tending. "What is it?" John hesitated, the weight of his thoughts evident. "We found Jack's words. We know where he spent his last days. But what about Scout? If he thought Scout survived, shouldn't we try to find out what happened?" Emily leaned on her gardening trowel, her brow furrowing. "Do you think there's any way we could? It's been so long, John." "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling that Buddy's part of this. He's too much like Scout. It's not just the timing or the way he acts. It's something deeper." Emily sighed, brushing dirt off her hands. "If we go looking, we have to be prepared for what we might not find." John nodded. "I know. But I can't ignore it." That evening they sat down as a family, including Sam, to discuss their plan. John explained his thoughts carefully, wanting Sam to understand without raising expectations too high. "Buddy helped us find Uncle Jack's cabin," John said, his voice calm and steady. "And we think he might be connected to Scout somehow. If there's a chance Scout survived and Buddy knows something, we want to follow him." Sam's face lit up with excitement. "You mean we're going on another adventure?" Emily quickly tempered his enthusiasm. "It's not the same as last time, sweetheart. We don't know if we'll find anything, and we don't want you to get hurt again." Sam looked at Buddy, who was sitting alert at his side. "Buddy will keep me safe," he said confidently. Emily exchanged a glance with John, her lips pressed tightly together. "All right," she said finally. "But we stay close together and we turn back if it gets dangerous." The next morning, the family ventured into the forest again, Buddy leading the way. This time the atmosphere was different, less urgent but no less tense. The sunlight filtering through the trees gave the journey an almost surreal quality, as if they were walking between the present and the past. Buddy moved with the same determination as before, his steps sure and deliberate. He paused occasionally to sniff the air, then pressed onward, the family following closely behind. "Do you recognize this area?" Emily asked John as they stepped over a fallen log. John shook his head. "Not really. Jack never mentioned anything about this part of the forest. But it feels familiar somehow." They walked in silence for another hour before Buddy stopped abruptly, his ears perking up. He sniffed the ground, then let out a low, sharp bark. "What is it, boy?" Sam asked, crouching beside him. Buddy began digging at the ground, his movements quick but careful. Emily and John knelt to help, brushing away dirt until they uncovered something buried just beneath the surface. A small, rusted metal tag. John picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The engraved letters were faint but still legible. Scout. Emily's breath caught. "It's his tag." Sam looked up, his eyes wide. "Does that mean Scout was here?" John nodded, his grip tightening on the tag. "It means we're closer to understanding what happened." Buddy didn't stop there. He barked again, turning sharply to the left and continuing through the forest. The family followed, their hearts pounding with anticipation. After another stretch of walking, they came to a shallow creek. Buddy crossed it easily, but Sam hesitated, his injured leg still healing. "Careful," Emily said, helping him step onto the slick rocks. John supported him from the other side, and together they made it across. On the far bank, Buddy stood still, his tail wagging slowly. He had stopped in front of a cluster of stones, half covered in moss. As the family approached, they saw what had caught his attention. A makeshift grave, marked by a wooden cross carved with the word Scout. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He buried him." John knelt in front of the grave, his hands resting on his knees. "Jack must have done this," he said quietly. "He must have lost Scout before the flood took him." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she sank to the ground beside her husband. "He loved that dog so much," she murmured. "Even in the end, he made sure Scout had a place to rest." Sam stood silently, his hand resting on Buddy's back. "Do you think Buddy knew?" he asked, his voice barely audible. John looked at the dog, who sat calmly beside the grave, his head bowed as if in respect. "I think Buddy understands," he said. "Maybe more than we ever will." The family spent a few quiet moments at the site, their emotions raw but their hearts lighter. Emily gently placed the collar they had found on the cross, completing the story Jack had started so many years ago. As they turned to leave, Buddy lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the grave. Then he stood, his tail wagging slightly, and followed his family back through the forest. In that moment, Emily realized something she hadn't before. Buddy wasn't just a part of their family. He was a part of their history, a living connection to the love and resilience that had carried them through loss and brought them back together again. The walk back from Scout's resting place was quieter than the journey there. The weight of what they had discovered sat heavily on their shoulders, yet it wasn't entirely a burden. It felt like closure, though bittersweet. Buddy moved at a slower pace now, his energy subdued, as if he understood the significance of what they had uncovered. Sam was the first to speak, breaking the silence. "Uncle Jack must have loved Scout a lot to make sure he had a grave." Emily glanced at him, her face softening. "He did, sweetheart. They went through so much together. Jack wouldn't have left him without a proper goodbye." Sam looked down at Buddy, his small hand gripping the dog's fur as they walked. "Do you think Buddy remembers Scout?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable but deeply felt. John finally spoke, his voice steady but reflective. "Maybe Buddy doesn't remember Scout the way we think of remembering. But I think he knows what Scout meant to Jack, and what Jack means to us." Sam nodded, his face thoughtful. "I'm glad Buddy's here." Emily reached out and ruffled Sam's hair. "We all are." That evening, the family sat in the living room, the house quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fireplace. Buddy lay sprawled on the rug, his body relaxed but his eyes alert as he watched each member of the family in turn. Emily held Jack's notebook in her lap, turning the pages slowly. She had read each entry at least twice, but tonight she lingered on the last one. Jack's words, written with such strength and love despite his desperate circumstances, felt like a bridge connecting them across the years. "Do you think he ever gave up hope?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. John shook his head without hesitation. "No. If he'd given up, he wouldn't have done all of this, writing the notebook, burying Scout, leaving signs for someone to find. He believed someone would come." Emily ran her fingers over the faded ink. He deserved so much more time. John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He gave us everything he had, Em. His love for us, his strength to keep going. And now we know his story. We can keep that alive. Sam, curled up in the corner of the couch with Buddy's head resting on his lap, spoke up. I'll tell everyone about Uncle Jack. And Buddy too. They're heroes. Emily smiled, her chest tightening at her son's earnestness. Yes, they are. Over the next few days, the family slowly began to weave Jack's story into their lives. The notebook and Scout's collar found a permanent place on the mantel, next to the photo of Jack. Every evening, Sam would sit with Buddy and retell parts of the story, as though practicing to share it with the world. One afternoon, Sam asked, "Can we visit Uncle Jack's cabin again someday?" Emily hesitated. The idea of returning stirred a mixture of emotions, sadness for what had been lost, but also gratitude for what they had found. Maybe, she said carefully, when the time feels right. Sam seemed satisfied with that, turning his attention back to Buddy, who wagged his tail in response to the boy's gentle petting. As time passed, the family's bond with Buddy deepened. He became more than just a companion. He was a symbol of resilience and connection. But there was something more about him, an unspoken wisdom that seemed to go beyond his instincts. It was in the way he stayed close during moments of silence, the way he responded to each family member with a quiet understanding. Emily noticed it most one evening as she sat alone in the kitchen. The house was quiet, Sam already asleep and John finishing a project in the garage. Buddy padded in and sat beside her, resting his head on her knee. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting back to Scout, to Jack, to everything Buddy had led them to. "You're not just a dog, are you?" she said softly. "You're part of something bigger." Buddy looked up at her, his brown eyes steady and calm. For a moment, she felt as though he understood every word she said. She smiled, the weight in her chest easing just a little. "Thank you, Buddy," she whispered, "for bringing him back to us." That night, as the family settled in, Emily and John stood in the doorway of Sam's room. He was fast asleep, his arm draped protectively over Buddy, who lay curled up at his side. "He's healing," Emily said quietly, her voice full of warmth. John nodded. "We all are." As they turned off the light and closed the door, Buddy lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. He watched them for a moment before laying his head back down, a soft sigh escaping as he drifted into sleep. And for the first time in years, the house felt whole again. The morning sun poured through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the table where Emily and John sat with steaming mugs of coffee. The air felt lighter, as though the discoveries of the past few weeks had eased a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying. Buddy lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight near the back door, his chest rising and falling steadily. Sam's laughter echoed from the backyard as he ran around, tossing a ball for Buddy to fetch. "He hasn't stopped talking about Jack and Scout," Emily said, her voice soft with a mix of pride and nostalgia. "Every night, he asks me to tell him another story about them." John smiled, tracing his finger along the edge of his mug. "Maybe we should write those stories down. For Sam, and for Jack. So they're never forgotten." Emily's gaze shifted to the mantel, where Jack's notebook rested next to the photo of him and Scout. "That's not a bad idea," she said. "Jack's story deserves to be told." Later that afternoon, as Sam played outside with Buddy, Emily found herself flipping through Jack's notebook again. She paused at a blank page near the back and reached for a pen. Her hand hovered over the paper, uncertain, before she began to write. "For Jack, who showed us that love and courage live on through the bonds we create, no matter how much time passes. And for Buddy, who reminded us to follow the trails of those we've lost and find them again." The words felt like a promise, one she was determined to keep. That evening, the family decided to take a walk together. The forest, once a place of fear and loss, now felt like a space of reflection and connection. Sam walked ahead with Buddy, the boys' laughter mixing with the rustling leaves. "Do you think Buddy still remembers the cabin?" Sam asked, looking back at his parents. Emily nodded. "I think so. But I also think Buddy knows we don't need to go back right now. He gave us what we needed." Sam looked down at Buddy, his small hand resting on the dog's back. "You're a good boy," he said earnestly. Buddy wagged his tail in response, his movements steady and sure as they followed the familiar path through the woods. As the walk continued, Sam's curiosity bubbled over. "Mom, why do you think Uncle Jack loved Scout so much?" Emily thought for a moment before answering. "Because Scout wasn't just his dog. He was Jack's partner, his protector, and his friend. Just like Buddy is to you." Sam smiled, looking down at Buddy again. Then I'll always take care of him, just like Uncle Jack took care of Scout. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat at her son's words, but she managed to smile. That's all he needs, sweetheart. When they returned home, the family gathered on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was filled with the hum of crickets and the occasional bark from Buddy, who sprawled contentedly at their feet. John turned to Emily, his voice low but resolute. I think we should share Jack's story. Not just with Sam but with others. Emily looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. You mean with the world? Why not? John said. It's a story of love, courage, and resilience. People need that. They need to know that even in the hardest times there's hope. Emily nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. But how do we tell it? John smiled. We start with what we know. The notebook, the memories, and Buddy. He's the thread that ties it all together. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Emily felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The grief of losing Jack had been a heavy weight, but now it felt like something they could carry together. A legacy, not a loss. She reached down to scratch Buddy behind the ears, her voice soft. Thank you, Buddy. For everything. Buddy looked up at her, his eyes shining in the dim light. And in that moment, Emily felt the connection between past and present, between Jack and Scout, between Buddy and their family. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was their story, one they would carry forward together. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The small town library was unusually quiet as Emily and John set up a modest display on a long wooden table. Sam stood beside them, holding Buddy's leash tightly, his face beaming with excitement. On the table rested Jack's notebook, Scout's collar, and a framed photo of Jack with Scout. Behind them, a small banner read, A Legacy of Love and Courage, Jack's Story. It had taken weeks to gather the courage to share Jack's story with the community. Emily and John had spent countless nights poring over his notebook, weaving his words into a narrative they felt honored his life. Now, with the support of their friends and neighbors, they were ready to present it. Do you think people will come? Sam asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and nerves. They will, John said confidently, patting his son's shoulder. Because Jack's story matters. And so does Buddy's? Sam nodded, his grip on Buddy's leash tightening. I'm glad we're telling it. Uncle Jack would be proud. Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I think so too, sweetheart. As the room began to fill with familiar faces, Emily's heart swelled with gratitude. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers had come, drawn by the flyer they had posted in the town square. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation as everyone settled into their seats. John stepped forward, clearing his throat. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. Tonight, we're here to celebrate the life of my brother, Jack, and the incredible bond he shared with his dog, Scout. Their story is one of resilience, love, and the unbreakable connection between humans and animals. He gestured toward the table where Emily picked up Jack's notebook. This notebook was Jack's last gift to us, she said. Through his words, we learned about his final days, his love for Scout, and his determination to protect him. But more than that, we learned about the strength of his spirit. Emily's voice faltered for a moment, but she continued. And it was Buddy, our dog, our hero, who led us back to Jack. Without him, we might never have known the truth. He connected us to the past and reminded us of the power of loyalty and love. As the evening unfolded, Emily and John shared passages from Jack's notebook, interspersed with their own memories of him. Sam chimed in occasionally, his young voice adding a touch of innocence and hope to the story. Buddy sat quietly by Sam's side, his presence a constant reminder of the bond they were celebrating. When the presentation ended, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted into applause. Tears glistened in the eyes of many in the audience, their expressions a mix of sadness and admiration. One elderly man approached Emily afterward, his voice trembling. Your brother's story, it's a reminder of how precious our connections are. Thank you for sharing it. Emily smiled through her tears. Thank you for listening. Later that night, as the family returned home, Sam knelt beside Buddy in the living room. You're part of Uncle Jack's story too, you know, he said, scratching Buddy behind the ears. You're like a hero from a book. Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into Sam's touch. His calm, steady gaze seemed to carry an unspoken promise. I'll always be here for you. Emily and John watched from the couch, their hearts full. We did the right thing, John said quietly. Sharing Jack's story. It's not just ours anymore, it belongs to everyone now. Emily nodded. And Buddy will make sure we never forget it. That night, as the house settled into peaceful silence, Emily found herself standing in front of the mantel. She reached out and touched Jack's notebook, then Scout's collar. "You're with us, Jack," she whispered. "Always?" Buddy appeared at her side, pressing his head against her leg. She looked down at him, her smile soft and full of gratitude. "And you," she said, kneeling to wrap her arms around him, "you're our bridge to him. Our guardian." Buddy licked her cheek, his tail wagging gently. For a moment, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future melted away, replaced by a sense of connection that was as unbreakable as it was profound. In the quiet of the night, the family slept soundly, Buddy curled at the foot of Sam's bed. The stars outside shone brightly, casting a gentle light over the house. And somewhere in the stillness of the forest, Jack's memory lingered, alive in the stories they told, the bonds they cherished, and the love that would carry them forward. Because some legacies aren't just remembered, they're lived. Jack's story reminds us that love, courage, and loyalty can transcend time, connecting us even when we think all is lost. Through Buddy's unwavering determination and Jack's enduring strength, we've seen how the bonds we create, whether with family or the animals we hold dear, can guide us back to what truly matters. As you finish this journey with us, take a moment to reflect on the heroes in your life, the ones who show courage in silence, loyalty in action, and love without condition. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like the bond between Jack and Scout, stories like these are meant to be shared. Like, comment, and let us know how this journey made you feel. Share it with someone who needs to remember the power of connection. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to our channel. Let's keep the legacy of love and courage alive together.